Welcome to today's explainer. Is the hymen really a biological indicator of virginity? Well, if you've grown up believing it's a fragile seal that breaks upon first intercourse, it's time to look at what the medical literature actually says. The hymen is arguably one of the most misunderstood structures in the entire human body. It is not a seal, it's a dynamic, elastic, and highly variable piece of anatomy, one that changes throughout your entire life. And yet for centuries, it's been treated as something it biologically is not. Today, we're going straight to the science, utilizing embryology, histology, and clinical medicine to cut through these centuries of misunderstanding and dismantle the myths once and for all.
Okay, let's dive into this. For centuries, a pervasive cultural myth has dictated that the hymen is a foolproof biological indicator of virginity. You know the assumption. If it's intact, a person is a virgin. If it is broken, they're not. But when we actually look at the hard evidence compiled by medical professionals, forensic experts, and global health organizations, we really have to ask ourselves, does this widespread cultural belief actually align with human anatomy? Spoiler alert, no, it absolutely doesn't. Let's start with a really clear anatomical picture. Clinically speaking, the hymen is a thin, elastic mucosal fold of tissue located right at the border of the vaginal opening, which technically is called the vaginal introitus. Notice the specific words the medical texts use here: dynamic, elastic, mucosal fold. It is not a rigid barrier. It is living tissue. Once we grasp its true biological definition, we can begin to see exactly why the traditional, static concept of the hymen simply doesn't hold up to scientific scrutiny. And this brilliantly illustrates the wider view, because understanding the hymen means understanding its neighbors too. Alongside the vaginal corona, clitoris, and urethra, you have the ducts of Bartholin's glands. These are paired glands that secrete a mucus-like fluid absolutely essential for lubrication. They are so often completely overlooked in casual conversation, but they're a critical part of the functional anatomy of this region. A proper clinical assessment always examines this full, functional anatomical picture, rather than just zooming in on one isolated structure. So here is the emphatic juxtaposition. The myth tells us we're dealing with an isolated, brittle seal that just breaks or pops. But the biological reality, it's an integrated, highly elastic mucosal fold that stretches. Because it naturally has an opening to allow menstrual blood to pass, it doesn't just shatter like glass. In fact, clinical and forensic literature consistently documents that penetration doesn't even always cause visible tearing. The assumption that intercourse guarantees a torn hymen is completely unsupported by peer-reviewed evidence. Here's something many people just don't realize. There is literally no single normal hymen. It naturally appears in several variants. It could be annular, forming a common ring, cribriform, featuring multiple small perforations, kind of like a sieve, microperforate, with a very tiny central opening, or septate, which is divided by a central band of tissue. And crucially, there's also the imperforate variant, which completely lacks an opening. Now, this is the only variant that typically requires a minor clinical intervention to allow menstrual flow to escape. Every other variation, just a natural difference in human anatomy. Take a look at the incredible visual diversity of this tissue, which is also known as the vaginal corona. Notice the shape. It isn't a perfect, smooth, cookie-cutter circle. Superficial notches, fleshy tags, and little bumps are perfectly natural, non-specific findings. For a long time, untrained examiners might look at these natural indentations and mistakenly interpret them as healed trauma or proof of past sexual activity. But as we can clearly see, this unevenness is literally just standard biological variation. Another fascinating example is the fimbriated variant, which features multiple natural folds or notches right along the edge. Honestly, if you didn't know better, you might assume this jagged, fringed appearance is the result of tearing, but it's absolutely not. This uneven fringed edge is the biological default for so many individuals. It is exactly how the tissue naturally formed during their development in the womb. Even with an annular or crescentic morphology, where there's a natural deficiency of tissue at the top, the risk of misinterpretation is extremely high. This is exactly why forensic examiners and clinicians must be thoroughly, rigorously trained on these exact variations. Because without proper training, a totally natural crescent shape or a superficial notch could lead to a devastating misdiagnosis in medical and legal contexts, falsely concluding that abuse or intercourse has occurred when examining perfectly normal, uninjured anatomy. Now, what's really interesting about this microscopic level is the histology. This tissue is composed of non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, which is a mouthful, but it's the exact same type of tissue found in other mucosal surfaces of your body, like the inside of your cheek. Beneath that lies the lamina propria, a layer incredibly rich in microcapillaries, elastic fibers, and a connective tissue matrix. This specific structure is what gives the hymen its incredible flexibility. It is engineered by nature to stretch and flex under mechanical pressure without necessarily tearing, entirely dismantling the notion of a brittle barrier.
To definitively understand why this tissue even exists, we need to trace it all the way back to its origins in fetal development. Between approximately 6 and 20 weeks of gestation, a process called canalization occurs. Basically, the vaginal plate, which starts as a solid cord of cells, begins to hollow out to form the vaginal canal. As that happens, the hymen remains at the bottom. It is essentially a vestigial remnant. It was never purposefully built to be a barrier or some kind of seal of purity. It is quite literally just a developmental leftover. Further dismantling the myth of a static seal is the fact that this tissue, like most mucosal tissue, is highly responsive to hormones across your entire lifespan. At birth, the tissue is actually thick and highly vascular, thanks to residual maternal estrogen. But during childhood, without those hormones, it becomes thin, pale, translucent, and very sensitive. Then, at puberty, rising estrogen dramatically increases its vascularization and elasticity, making it robust and stretchy. Finally, post-menopause, declining estrogen causes the tissue to atrophy, becoming thinner and more fragile again.
So the crucial point is this. The global clinical consensus is clear and definitive. An examination of the hymen is not an accurate or reliable test of previous sexual activity. Because the structure is naturally varied, it's hormonally dynamic, and it can stretch without tearing or, frankly, be altered by completely non-sexual activities, relying on it as a test of virginity is scientifically baseless. It is completely medically invalid. Which brings us to a final, really important question. If hard science, from embryology to microscopic histology to forensic medicine, proves without a shadow of a doubt that the hymen is simply a dynamic vestigial fold of tissue, why do we still let a cultural myth dictate human value? Fragility testing and the intense stigma surrounding this anatomy have caused immeasurable harm globally. Armed with this undeniable medical reality, you now have the power to challenge these misconceptions and help shift a cultural narrative that is centuries overdue for a change. Thanks for joining me on today's Explainer, and keep learning.